Welcome to an introduction to God's existence, or arguments for and against God's existence. In this section of the course, I'll give you a brief overview of arguments for and against God's existence, and then I will discuss the cosmological argument with you. So in this brief lecture, we'll talk about the concept of God, traditional arguments for and against God's existence, and the role of these arguments. Namely, what should we expect from these arguments? What should we expect them to prove that God exists or that God doesn't exist, something like that. When it comes to the concept of God, there are many concepts that a person might propose of the divine or God or the gods. And, through various cultures, you have various concepts. But we're going to be looking at a sort of Western conception rooted in Judeo-Christian concept of God and Western philosophy. So I'll call this perfect being theology, and you might wonder what qualities make up the concept of God on perfect being theology. So if God is a perfect being, what properties would God possess? Supposing, God exists, or just dealing with the concept. So traditionally, at least three properties have been cited: that God would be omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. And you can cite other properties, maybe omnipresence or something like that, love, but omnipotence is the property of having all power that could possibly be had. Omniscience is the property of having all the knowledge that could possibly be had. And moral perfection is to be a moral being without flaw. So to be morally flawless. Okay. So that's the sort of concept of God that we're working with here. And can we have philosophical arguments for or against the existence of such a being? So I want to know what you believe. Do you believe in God, and why? I'd be interested to know. Maybe email me, put it in the discussion board. Do you believe in God as described? Do you think there is no higher power at all? That would be something like atheism. Do you believe in a higher power but not the God just described? Or are you agnostic? You don't believe that God exists, and you don't believe that God doesn't exist because you don't think we're in a position to say. Or something like that. I'm not saying what sort of motivates agnosticism. It's just a position of not knowing whether or not God exists, and maybe even not believing that God exists and not believing that God doesn't. So as far as the traditional arguments for and against God's existence, for God's existence there is the ontological argument, cosmological argument, design argument, and moral argument. Against God's existence, there is the problem of evil and maybe the incoherence or alleged incoherence of the concept of God. So let's look at these, each of them briefly. Again, we're going to be looking at the cosmological argument in much more detail, but let's briefly go over them. So ontological argument. On this argument, the claim is that the very concept of God entails that God exists. Something like that, right? The very concept of God entails that God exists. So Anselm had an ontological argument. He's very famous for it, and he defined God as that being than which none greater can be conceived. And I mean, in essence, whether you can follow this or not, because it's so brief, but in essence, if God just exists in our minds, but not reality, then God isn't the being we're thinking of in our minds isn't that being than which none greater can be conceived. So if we're truly going to conceive of that being than which none greater can be conceived, we'd have to posit that this being has existence or exists, because otherwise there would be something greater than it if it doesn't exist. And so therefore that being than which none greater can be conceived exists, right? And you can look up the argument and try to wrestle through it yourself. I'm just going to give a sketch of each of them. There are other ontological arguments. Alvin Plantinga has a version. Kurt Gödel has a version. The cosmological argument goes from the claim that something exists, the very modest claim that there's something that exists, to the claim that there is some unique being of all existence that brought into being everything else. The design argument says that given the design features we see in biology and in the broader universe, there must be some sort of intelligence outside the universe who brought all of this into being, or within the universe who ordered it. I don't know. That some intelligent being is responsible for the order and design of the universe. And there are obvious design features in our universe: DNA, the structure of a cell, the symmetry of the human body, the constants of physics, etc. Then the moral argument says that something like, if right and wrong exist, then God must exist, right? And the ways that this is spelled out are various. The same goes for all of these arguments. But one might say something like the following: the best explanation for why there's such a thing as right or wrong is that there's a deity who's responsible for right and wrong, the existence of those rules, the fact that we're obligated to obey them, that kind of thing. When it comes to the problem of evil, this is an argument against God's existence. It says that given the suffering and evil in the world, there must not be a good God who created the world and is governing it. So you think about it. J.L. Mackie in Evil and Omnipotence, he puts it in the following way: if God is morally perfect and God is all powerful, why would any evil exist? Because if he's morally perfect, then he would want to stop evil. And if he's all powerful, he can stop evil. Yet evil exists, therefore there is no God, or at least not a good God, or at least not an all-powerful God, something like that, right? And you can look at the responses given to this by Alvin Plantinga, the free will defense. But yeah, that's a big issue for atheists, that they think, how can a good God be governing the universe with all that's going on these days and throughout history? When it comes to the incoherence of the concept of God, the claim is that some of the properties of God are self-undermining, or that God couldn't have all the properties that we traditionally ascribe to him, because that would involve a contradiction or an inconsistency. And a classic example is the stone paradox, where we might say, we might ask, can God create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it? So if he can create such a stone, then there's something he can't do, namely lift it. If he cannot create such a stone, then there's something he cannot do, namely make it. So either way, there's something God can't do, and therefore God is not omnipotent. And any omnipotent being wouldn't be able to, survive this paradox, because there'll end up being something that the being can't do. Yeah, that's one issue. I'm not too impressed by it, but that's an example of an alleged incoherence in the concept of God. Okay, when it comes to the arguments for and against God's existence, they can be either a priori or a posteriori. And this is true with arguments in general. So an a priori argument rests only on a priori premises, and an a priori premise is something that can be known apart from or independent of experience. So let's think of an a priori statement or premise. What would one be? Okay, here's an example. Triangles have three sides. that's something that you can know apart from experience. All you need is the concept of a triangle, and you know that triangles have three sides. Bachelors are unmarried males. You don't need to go ask bachelors and interview 100 bachelors to find out that they're all unmarried. It's just part of the concept of being a bachelor that they're unmarried. So these are things that you can know apart from experience, assuming you have the relevant concepts. So when it comes to arguments for God's existence or against God's existence, the ontological argument is a priori. It's just a matter of definition or something, that God is the greatest possible being. So you can know that apart from experience. And then the a priori argument would rely on this premise as well as others that are a priori to conclude that God exists. So you could, just sit in your armchair and think about the very concept of God and conclude that God exists. You don't need to look under a leaf or through a microscope. An a posteriori premise is an argument. A posteriori argument is an argument that depends on at least one a posteriori premise. And an a posteriori premise can only be known by means of experience. You need to, get up out of your easy chair and you need to go start investigating the world to know these sorts of claims. So an example would be leaves are green. An example would be there are 8 planets in our solar system. Sorry, Pluto. So an example of an a posteriori argument when it comes to arguments for and against God's existence is the cosmological argument. This starts with a very basic claim that something exists. And you can know that fairly early on in your experience of the world, but it does require experience in order to know it. So let me test you. Is the following statement a priori? Water is H2O. In fact, it's not a priori. It's something that you can only know by asking a chemist or by investigating for yourself, doing the experiments, or reading a chemistry textbook. So it's a posteriori. It requires experience in order to know. What about this one? 1 + 1 = 2. In fact, that one is a priori. If you just have the concept of 1, addition, equality, and 2, you can, put 1 and 1 together. You can come up with a conclusion that 1 + 1 = 2. So yes, this is a priori. So what are the goals, or what is the goal of arguments for and against God's existence? What should we expect to get out of them? I would say, number one, that we should not expect proofs for or against God's existence. Now, there might be a proof, but we shouldn't expect it. Proof is sort of a strict thing. You find it in geometry and mathematics and logic, but not many other places do you find a proof. So when it comes to arguments for God's existence, we shouldn't expect a proof, but that's no fault of arguments for God's existence or against God's existence. That's just a feature of human experience, that we don't have proofs for many things. Even the sciences do not rely on proofs largely, but on induction. 2, instead of proof, we should look for, good arguments with reasonable premises. And finally, we should look at all the available evidence to make a determination. So a detective at a crime scene does not simply call the case closed when he finds some DNA at the murder scene or the crime scene. Jones must have done it because his DNA is at the crime scene. No, the detective needs to go talk to Jones, see if Jones has an alibi, see if there are any other clues at the crime scene, and make a determination based on all things considered. And when it comes to any argument, really, but also arguments for or against God's existence, we shouldn't just consider, say, the cosmological argument and consider the case closed, or the problem of evil and consider the case closed. No, we need to take everything into account, even even reasons that aren't philosophical, personal experience and such, to make a determination regarding God's existence. Okay, next lecture we'll talk about the cosmological argument.